I began looking at old photographs that were unlabeled, maybe almost 15 years ago, sometime after I retired, because I was one of the older people who might be able to identify. And then at some point I began giving talks. I remember I gave a talk to the volunteers. It was my first one. I was using old 35mm slides, and nobody told me that the slides were advancing automatically. So that was an interesting experience. And I gave a couple of other talks and sort of got more and more interested in this. 8 years ago, when Dr. Streck called me into his office and said, "I'd like you to consider writing a book of Bassett's history." And I sort of said, okay, not having any idea what was going to happen after that. So I began working on it, and I began writing, and I had to relearn how to write. I was not a professional writer by any means, so I struggled along the line. My friend Marion Carl's son-in-law, Garrett Livermore, who was at that time the education director at the New York State Historical Association, began saying, "Look, John, you have to get on with this book." And then he finally said, "I'm getting you an editor." And he chose a friend of his from his college days by the name of Felicia Halpert. And once she was on board, this was about a little over 2.5 years ago, then things really began to pick up, and I began to learn what I had to do. And she re-taught me how to write using short sentences and short paragraphs and breaks, and it became a really exciting experience, and it just progressed in a very new kind of way once she was there to work with me. As the history rolled along and I got to the present era, that this was becoming very, very difficult. Interfacing personalities, problems, issues, all sorts of things. And I also realized how personal the history was. And people that I talked to, and I interviewed some 60 people, long interviews, they didn't understand the original themes of going back to 1815. Their history started when they arrived at Bassett. And they wanted to see what I was going to write about in the era when they were here. And that remained a central focus. And then I finally realized that it was very personal for me, the author, as well. I mean, I arrived in 1956. I almost said 1856. And my whole slant was very personal. So the people I chose to put in the book, the people I interviewed, would probably not be the same people that someone else writing the history would have done. So that gives it a very personal slant. And I had to, I just couldn't put everything in a book of reasonable size. I mean, I would interview somebody for an hour, maybe, and then one line about that person might appear in the book. And I learned from Dr. George Minor Mackenzie's grandson, Dr. Gilbert Mudge, who's a high official at the Brigham and Women's Hospital right now, and the Mackenzie family have been very helpful to me, that the phrase "left on the cutting room floor" was what you had to realize. You couldn't include all these people.